Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of One More Thing Before I Go, the podcast that celebrates the extraordinary lives of everyday people. You're joining us at an exciting time. We're beginning a new series on the Enneagram, and this is episode 1 in that series. The hope is to go at least through the month. Some of that will depend on how many more questions we get back. We've received 4 or 5 so far. I'm hoping to make this a question and response, question and answer type of thing. So the more questions we get, the more episodes we'll have. I'll try to answer them as thoroughly as I can, and we'll try to have some fun along the way. What we're hoping to do today is establish just a baseline so people who've never heard of the Enneagram can have a decent idea of what we're talking about, and we can move forward from there. So we'll talk a little bit about triads, we'll talk about our passions or sins, and we'll talk about a few other things that really helps us to understand what makes the Enneagram different from some of the other personality types and why it's so important in our everyday life. I'm excited. I hope you are too. So let's not waste too much more time. Here we go. Episode 1 on the Enneagram. Okay, I think the best starting point is to introduce the idea of the triads. And this is something you've probably heard of before, the fact that everyone has a heart, a body, and a mind. Sometimes we say a soul or a spirit instead of the heart, but it's basically the same thing. Your guts, your instincts, your head, where you do your thinking, and your heart, where you do your feeling. And the Enneagram really breaks down into these 3 categories as well. And so when you find between the 9 numbers, there are 3 numbers that fall into each of these categories. It really helps us start to differentiate between the types a little bit. Let's start with the gut triad. That's also known as the instinctive triad. They tend to have issues with control, and it's because they're looking for autonomy. They're looking for, I want to be in control of my own life, and so they don't want other people to control them. These types of people typically have problems with aggression and or repressing their anger, and underneath their defenses, they carry quite a deal of rage. It could come out in different ways for different types of people, but it's buried in there somewhere. There's a lot of anger issues. So for the people in the gut triad, when you encounter life, your first reaction is to do something. You tend to act before you think, and anger is always bubbling right beneath the surface. So if you're taking notes at home, the gut triad is the 8, the 9, and the 1. And we'll talk in more detail down the road about what those particular numbers actually mean. Let's move on for now, though, to the heart triad, also known as the feeling triad. These people tend to have issues with self-image and identity. Who am I? And they tend to seek attention. This type tends to believe that stories and qualities that are told about themselves are their actual identities, which obviously causes problems in the real world. And underneath of their defenses, this type tends to carry a great deal of shame. So when the heart triad person encounters life, their first reaction is to feel something. So they tend to be overly emotional in some capacity. And beneath the surface, shame is always waiting to rear its ugly head. So again, if you're taking notes at home, this is the 2, the 3, and the 4 in the heart triad. And then lastly, we have the head triad, or the thinking triad. This group tends to have issues with insecurity and anxiety. The biggest thing that they're looking for in life is not autonomy, like the gut triad, and it's not attention, like the heart triad. The head triad is looking for security. So they'll tend to engage in behaviors that they believe will enhance their safety and security. And underneath all of that, they carry a great deal of fear. So beneath all their defenses, if you can tear that down, you realize they're at their core very fearful people. When people in the head triad encounter life, their first reaction is to think and plan. as opposed to do or feel. So as a result, the head types tend to overthink things because, again, fear is always waiting beneath the surface. So this is the 5, the 6, and the 7. So if you notice, the numbers break down oddly. 8, 9, and 1 is in the gut, but it forms a full circle and it's a complete circle. So there's no real reason why any one number is the number that it is. We have to assign it something. So 8, 9, 1 is gut. 2, 3, 4 is heart. 5, 6, 7 is head. And for each of those types, we tend to do things very instinctively. Sometimes they just are what comes naturally to us. Sometimes it's things that we start to do as a child. We get the responses, the reactions that we want as we start to grow up. And those are the things that we begin to fall back on. They become instinctive, whether they initially were or not. And so at some point, our personality is actually starting to come out when we're not really paying attention. The best description I've ever heard of for the word personality is from Father Richard Rohr, and he says, personality is what shows up when we don't. I think that's perfect because in so many ways we can choose to be the person that we want to be if we're conscious and if we're present in a situation. But typically we're not. We sleepwalk through life, we sleepwalk through our day, and so our personality is what just naturally happens because we're not paying attention at all. I urge you to keep that in mind as we move through all of this, because identifying your personality, whether it's with the Myers-Briggs test or Strengths Finders or this Enneagram or anything else, your personality should never be used as an excuse to do what you do or to be the type of person that you are. You should always be looking to improve, to become a better person, and you should be using these tools as a way to identify, a way to improve, to become more whole in some way. And so personality is what shows up when we don't. What we're trying to do is not further identify how we sleepwalk through life. We really should be trying to identify who it is that we're supposed to be and how to live that out. So at the heart of most of our Enneagram work, that's really what we're trying to figure out is why do we react the way that we do? And is there a better way to go about things? We all have default behaviors that we employ when we're feeling anxious or stressed or just life is getting us down, but it's often unhealthy behaviors. And so we need to identify what parts of those things are healthy and what parts of them are unhealthy, and how do we change the unhealthy parts so that we can grow as a person. So then we can start to break this down a little bit, one number at a time, and realize that each one of us really operate trying to attain a very simple, a very basic desire. And what happens over time is that we end up distorting that and twisting it in some way, so we're pursuing something that we don't actually even want anymore. But it's so far buried beneath the junk of what's going on that we don't even realize that what we're pursuing is no longer the thing that we want. And it's bolstered, it's fortified by things that we've heard and learned from other people as we're growing up, and then we filter the things that we hear from people even now as adults through that same different tint in the glasses, as it were. It's further fortified by if you're a religious type of person or you grow up around people who go to church. You may even hear some of those various things that they mean well, but that tends to dig the hole even deeper. And we'll talk about some of those. And then we'll talk about what we needed to hear instead. And all those then contribute to what we call our deadly sins. And it's our preferred way of circumventing what we need to actually get what we want. And so we'll talk in detail about those. Let's start with the 8. 8s have a basic desire to simply protect themselves, even to defend people around them from pain, from vulnerability, whatever the case is. They tend to ultimately, though, distort that, and it turns into not really even protecting, but constantly fighting with anyone and everyone about anything and everything. And they do this because one of the main things they learned at a very young age is that it's not okay to be vulnerable or to trust anyone. They're constantly in fear of being stabbed in the back, and maybe from a perceived reality, or maybe because it's happened one too many times. And so now they put up so many walls that they've sworn not to ever open up to people again. As a result, they're keeping everyone kind of at arm's length and want to protect themselves instead. It's not helped at all that at church, the eights constantly would hear, be ready to stand up for what you believe, be ready to fight. And that may not have been a bad thing, but for the eights to have that piled on top of what was already being distorted in their life, it didn't help. What eights needed to hear, and what they continue to need to hear, is that you will not be betrayed. If they can believe that, wrap their hearts around that, wrap their minds around that, the eights are able to actually open up, be more vulnerable, more transparent with the people around them, if they fully believe and buy into the idea that the people around them can be trusted and they're not going to betray them. All of those things end up contributing to the eight's deadly sin, which is lust. And it's a weird word, but basically in this context means intensity. Eights are the close talkers, the ones who get right up in your face, whether they're angry or excited or whatever. They get really close, they talk really loud, they get really excited about the things that they're talking about, the things that they're doing. Some people describe eights as just being too much. There's no way of really putting their finger on exactly what that means. It's just they're too much. They're too excited, they're too exaggerated, they're too emotional. Everything about the eight is kind of over the top. And obviously this is a little bit of a caricature. Not all eights are like this all the time, and especially when eights are not doing their work, they are doing the sleepwalking that we talked about, then they're going to look a lot more like this. Eights that are healthy tend to be a lot more protective and defenders of what is good in the world, and they're really keen on making sure that justice wins out. So they're great people to have on your side when you feel like you've been underserved, underprivileged in some way. If you have a healthy eight on your side, they're going to push for you. But there's also hope. The Enneagram shines a light on our darkest places, but it also helps in the way that it reveals our need for someone or something who embodies all the pure aspects that we see in each of us, and it just without all the distortions that our sin can cause. So this is where I give the disclaimer that I'm a Christian. I'm a believer in the Son of God, Jesus, and who he claims to be. If you're not, that's completely fine. There's so much of this that you can learn. The Enneagram is not inherently a Christian or religious thing. In some ways, the religious community has co-opted it because it's already built in with everything that we need to use to grow and learn. So we might as well. But for those of you who are Christians, those of you who are believers, here's the thing that eights in a pure aspect really live out. They're the aspect of God that they show to others is that God is powerful and God wants to protect the people that he loves. A good eight, a healthy eight, that's what they're embodying. And that's the type of aspect of God that they're reflecting to the rest of us. See, one of the things I love about the Enneagram is that it not only shows us our need to improve and to grow and be better people, but it shows us our need for others, because their true faces remind us of the aspects of God or your higher power that we otherwise forget about because it's not the type of thing that we embody. But so much of the work of the Enneagram is working toward wholeness and becoming a complete person. And so we need to see the good in other people and the way that they embody purity and wisdom and sacrifice and all the things that the other types will show in order for us to understand what it truly means to become whole. So we're not pursuing some weird ideal that pushes us further to the extreme of what we already are. Anyway, let's move on to the 9. Type 9's basic desire is to simply be at peace. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to have any type of conflict, and they're even okay with not having a lot of amazingly good things happen, because sometimes that interrupts our peace as well. So 9 wants to be at peace. They end up distorting it by almost being stubbornly neglectful. I don't want to change things. I'll actually actively run away from things that will cause change. And I just want things to be completely the same, status quo, because even if I don't like it, it could be worse. And so I'd rather just be at peace with the way things are. This is fortified as a child because 9s learned and heard constantly from others, it's not okay to assert yourself. The idea that children should be seen and not heard, 9s hear that loud and clear. And so even as adults, 9s are the type that will often just kind of merge and go along with what everybody else is doing. And if you ever ask their opinion, they'll just kind of shrug and say, I don't really know, whatever you want to do. That's a pretty big indicator that you've got a 9 in the room. It's not helped at all when they go to church and the 9s hear things like, oh, when somebody strikes you, make sure you turn the other cheek, because you're not allowed to actually have a thought for yourself. You're not allowed to stand up for yourself. Just whatever it takes to be at peace. So something as simple as turning the other cheek now gets distorted. What the 9s needed to hear is that their presence actually matters, that it does matter if they're in the room, that it does matter if they have a voice, and it does matter if they speak up. Too often they don't hear those things, and all that contributes to the 9's deadly sin, which is sloth. Now, this isn't just falling asleep, although the 9s tend to be the sleepiest types in the entire group of 9. Things just knock the energy out of the 9s completely. And so if you have one particular person that seems to need 9, 10, 11 hours of sleep, it may actually be that they're a 9. But sloth in this term really denotes developmental laziness, the unwillingness or the inability to actually go out of their way to improve themselves or to better their situation in any way. You may have a friend that is stuck in a dead-end job, that hates what they're doing, but is doing nothing actively to get out of it, to find a better situation. You may know somebody who's in a relationship that's similar. They don't really like the person that they're dating, but, it's better than being single. I don't really want to test the waters again. I'll just tolerate it. That's the type of laziness we're talking about here. And so 9s get stuck in a situation and they don't want to know what it's going to be like to go, it could get worse, it could get better, but I'm okay with just being status quo because, I don't want to interrupt my flow. I don't want to interrupt the peace that I've got. The hope for the 9, or the hope that the 9 shows us, is that we can actually find peace. There's so many of us that are fighting within ourselves, fighting with other people. The 9 reflects God's desire for unity, for all men to actually come together and to actually have peace, to finally be at rest and for things to be restored to the way that they should be. So when you look at a 9, don't see the flaws in them. Be reminded of the fact that they are actually helping us understand what it means to live a peaceful life. All right, and then we have the 1s. The basic desire for the 1s is to simply have integrity, for people to look at them and say, that's a good person. The thing that they're trying their best to avoid is to ever be blamed for anything. So they're going to have a perfectionist mindset, not so much because they really want to be that good, but because in some ways they just don't want to be blamed for anything. And so that desire to have integrity, which is fantastic, is distorted into this critical perfectionism idea that they can never be good enough, they can never live up to their own ideals or anybody else's ideals. And then ultimately, because they have such a high bar for themselves, they set that same high bar for everyone else. And so they become that same critical perfectionist with people around them. And so nobody else can live up to the same ideals that the one has. As a child or at a younger age, what they learned from other people is that it's not okay to make mistakes. It's not allowed to get a B on the report card. You're not allowed to screw up. You're not allowed to get anything less than first place in the race or in the sport that you play. Nothing short of winning is good enough. And it's not helped when we go to church and we hear things like man is inherently evil. That could be debated by theologians till the end of time. But when the one hears that, the one says, oh, it's never possible for me to actually be perfect. So I need to spend my entire life trying to do better, to be better. And maybe somebody will look at me and say, okay, well, they're at least as good as they possibly can be. And the one still won't be content with that. What ones needed to hear, and they continue to this day to need to hear, is that it is okay to make mistakes, that you can be a good person, that your gut reaction of I am terrible, I always make mistakes, I always screw up, and that's all I'm going to be, that's the thing that's not okay. But it is okay to make mistakes because we can learn through those things, we can grow through those things, and that's what actually makes us a better person, not the perfection. All those things then contribute to the one's anger issue. And it's not angry in the sense of the 8s being over the top and loud and boisterous and yelling all the time. The ones tend to be very resentful. There's a bitterness bubbling up with a lid on top of it. And so you're never going to really know that the one is upset with you until it boils over. And then they're not only going to be screaming at you about the thing that you did wrong this time, but the 13, 14, 15 years in the past of all the things that they've actually filed away, potentially even said that they forgot about or forgave you for, but now all those things are going to be coming to light and they're just going to be piling on because ones have a hard time letting go of imperfection. So even if they desperately want to, they have a hard time forgetting the times that you let them down when you weren't perfect. And ultimately it's because it reminds them of all the times that they let themselves or they let others down as well. So their person that they're the most angry with is usually themselves. Now, hidden inside of all those desires to do the right thing, we can be reminded of God's own perfection and the fact that good enough really isn't good enough, and that God is not content to leave the world the way that it is, but he also desires to restore all creation to himself and back to the way that he originally designed it, that we've screwed things up and he's got a plan for returning things back to himself. The ones can be a great reminder of that. Now, all three of those types that we just talked about are in the gut triad. And the thing that the gut triad has in common is that all three types struggle with anger. The 8s will externalize their anger, and now it's everybody else's fault. They put the blame on everyone else because they don't want to focus on themselves at all. The 9s will try their best to forget their anger, and so they deaden and dull the pain and all the emotions in hopes that they just forget that they're angry. And it looks like water off a duck's back, but I've talked to 9s that say like they remember the 1 or 2 times in their lives that they actually got angry and blew up, and they feel like they ruined people's lives, and then they file that away as I will never ever do that again. It doesn't matter how angry I am, I swear that I will never blow up like that again. And so they begin to once again deaden and dull the anger and try to forget it. And then the 1s internalize all that anger. As much as they may lash out on rare occasions at people, most of it is this internal criticism of never being good enough, never amounting to anything, and making too many mistakes. So they internalize all their anger, and so they're mad at themselves usually more than anything else. So we'll see that pop up from time to time. For the gut triad, it's anger, but one type will always externalize, One type will always internalize, and one type will try to forget whatever it is that they're struggling with. Now, I know we're flying through this rather quickly. Hopefully, in the next couple of weeks, we can start to break things down and get a little bit more detailed about each of the numbers. But I wanted to give you a high altitude, big picture view of how the Enneagram works. And hopefully, you're hanging in there. If you are, we're moving on to the heart triad, starting with number 2. 2s have a basic desire to be loved. And that sounds like the same would be the case for all of us, but for the 2s, it's even more prevalent. It's what drives them. Unfortunately, it ends up getting distorted into this need to be needed. They tend to develop codependent relationships because 2s have a hard time believing that they are worth loving unless they can prove to you first how lovable that they actually are. So they're extremely giving, extremely loving, but at the core, when they're unhealthy, they tend to do this because they have attachment issues and want to prove that they're worth loving. 2s tend to have been brought up in a situation when they were younger that taught them it's not okay to have your own needs. You're supposed to be looking after the needs of others and don't worry about your own. And this is reinforced sometimes by what they would hear at church, which is things like, you can't outgive God. It's true, but the 2s hear that and say, well, that sounds like a challenge. Let me try. What 2s ultimately need to hear is that they are wanted, not for what they do for people, not for how much they can give to people, but simply for who they are. And 2s, unfortunately, don't hear that often enough. All those things then contribute to the sin of a 2, which is pride. This idea that I'm dispensable. If I was no longer in your life, I bet you couldn't even function properly anymore. You don't know how good you've got it. You're so going to miss me when I'm gone, and you're not going to realize it until it's too late. So it's extremely subtle, because 2s can give off the air of being very, very humble people because they don't really think about themselves very often. But beneath all of that shine is really this pride of everyone needs me, everyone couldn't operate without me. 2s are the epitome of that old song, I want you to want me, I need you to need me, I'm loving you to love me, that sort of thing. When they're healthy, the 2s can remind us of God's selfless giving and his sacrifice, the fact that he was willing to die on a cross to take the place of what we ultimately deserve. There is no greater love than that, and 2s can be that type of self-sacrificing person when they're healthy. Next, we have the 3. The 3's basic desire is simply to be valuable. Some would say it's to be admired. Ultimately, the 3's want to contribute something of worth to the world and then to be acknowledged for it. That often gets distorted, however, with a 3 in simply chasing after success. Achievement after achievement, accomplishment after accomplishment, often to the detriment of the people around them, because they will sometimes climb over the people around them in order to achieve whatever their next big thing is. 3's often would learn from others that it's not okay to have your own feelings and identity. 3's tend to be the chameleon in the room. They can take on whatever personality that they feel like they need to in order to succeed, in order to climb whatever obstacle they see that they have in front of them. So they could walk into one room and take on the persona of, someone with a southern drawl and talk about farming equipment, and then walk into the next room and be buddies with a used car salesman, and in the next room talk tech and coding with middle class white yuppies. And they can move seamlessly between those environments. They don't seem to have a problem with that because the 3 likes to wear masks. And so they were taught at an early age who you are and who your own identity is doesn't matter. You need to morph and modify yourself if you want to actually get ahead in life. And if you have any feelings, don't identify with them, leave them to the side and suck it up. Just move on. 3s have that reinforced at church because the Apostle Paul said, I became all things to all people. So clearly I need to do that with people as well. If I'm in one environment, I'll act a certain way. When I'm in another environment, I'll act a different way. What 3s ultimately need to hear, though, is that you're loved for yourself. It's very similar to what the 2s need to hear, but the 3s want somebody to look at them and say, you did a good job. That's what they think. And so when somebody says that and they get the applause and the admiration, that dies after a time. And then they have to have some new goal, some new task, so that all the people around them clap and say, what a great job you did. Unfortunately, what the 3s really need to hear is, we still love you, even if you accomplish nothing the rest of your life. We still want you around, even if you achieve nothing but failure for the rest of your life. But for the 3s, the applause comes when success comes, and so they equate love with applause and applause with success. And so that's what they find themselves pursuing their entire lives. That contributes to the deadly sin of the 3, which is deception. And 3s may think they're really good at putting on such a good disguise, such a good mask that they can fake themselves. They can fake things through any situation. Usually, though, the person that the 3 is deceiving is themselves. They start to believe the lie that I am my persona, I am my mask. And over time, the 3s start to forget who they actually are because they've replaced who they are with who they are trying to be. And they wear so many different masks that they don't actually have a persona outside of the masks that they wear. But we can be reminded of aspects of God even within the 3, because God desires glory, God desires recognition, and he has achieved and accomplished so much that he rightly deserves that. And so we can see the achievements and successes of a 3 and be reminded of the fact that God also has a far greater accomplishments and deserves far greater praise than we could ever lavish on any one person. And then finally, in the heart triad, we have the 4. The 4's basic desire is to simply be themselves, not someone else's person, not the way that someone else wants them to be. They are individualists. Unfortunately, that can become distorted into just pure self-indulgence, that I don't care what other people think. I don't really pay attention to what other people say. I am so self-absorbed and self-indulgent that I only really think about myself. What 4s learned from other people around them is that it's not okay to be too functional or too happy. This idea that nobody can be that happy all the time. And 4s tend to actually want to wallow in more of the melancholy of things. And it's beautiful in some facets because the 4s, more than any other types, seem to embrace the idea that you can really be experiencing multiple emotions and multiple conflicting emotions at the same time. But 4s don't really understand that not everybody else can do that, and they also have a hard time really breaking themselves out of their emotions. And sometimes they even need to be reminded you are not your emotions. 4s also have this inherent belief that they're broken in some way, that there's something missing, that everybody else has this one thing that they just don't seem to have. And so they feel like an outsider and a loner. And so then that contributes to the self-indulgence idea, because they tend to then just recede even more and say, well, nobody understands me. They think I'm weird, so I'm going to actually pull back and show them just how weird I can be. This isn't helped by the fact that at church, they hear things like, you have a giant God-shaped hole in your heart. Well, for somebody who already feels like they're broken and they have a missing piece, that's a big deal for them to say that there's nothing that can fill it outside of God. And then when they approach religion, when they approach Jesus and they say, well, okay, I have Jesus in my life, but still I don't always feel fulfilled. Then they start to feel guilty. They start to feel like maybe there's something else wrong with me. And it doesn't really help. What the fours ultimately need to hear is that they're seen for who they are, that they don't need to go out of their way to be recognized, to be noticed. They don't have to be goofy and over the top in order for people to acknowledge that they exist. That, yes, we understand you are an individual. You're not one of the crowd, and we see you for who you are, not for who we want you to be. All those things contribute to the deadly sin of the four, which is envy. If they feel like I'm missing something everyone else has, and that's the underlying theme running through their entire life, then whenever something happens to other people, the fours will internalize that and say, well, I don't have that. Oh, and I don't have that. And they start to envy what happens in other people's lives. For fours, there's a lot of comparison going on between themselves and what happens to everyone else around them. And it ultimately ends up contributing to this idea that this belief in the four that I'm not whole, and no matter what I do, I will never be completely whole. I just need to resign myself to the idea that I'm broken, and I'm irreparably broken. But again, there's hope for all of us. For the four, they can remind us of God's infinite creativity and beauty. Fours tend to dive into the world of creativity. They want to be an individual. They want to express themselves in various ways. They tend to be artists and musicians and authors and poets and express themselves in vibrant ways. So the idea that God is infinitely creative is very easily reflected in the way that the four acts and carries themselves. And we need to be reminded of that. Now, just like for the 8s, 9s, and 1s, all of them struggle with this idea of anger, some type of anger. For the 2s, 3s, and 4s, their big struggle is with shame. This idea that there's something broken in me, there's something that doesn't work right, there's something missing, and that's something that causes me a great deal of shame. I'm embarrassed. The world can't know this about me, and so I have to hide it in some way. For the 2s, they tend to externalize their shame. They're wearing their hearts on their sleeve. They want you to know how broken they are in hopes that you will love them, because they've done enough to prove to you, look, even though this person is a wounded puppy, they can still be loved. For the 3, they just simply want to forget their shame. They put on a new mask every day, or put on their favorite mask every day, and have forgotten completely who they are as a person, and they've buried whatever repressed memories and hurts and fears along with it. And then the 4s will internalize their shame. They live in that world of I'm broken, there's something wrong with me, and that's just the way that it's going to be, and carry that shame with them internally, even though they might look like bright, happy, peppy people on the outside, wearing bright, vibrant colors. Inside, there's a lot of darkness, and 4s can struggle mightily with depression. So that's the heart triad, which leaves us with the head triad, the 5, 6, and 7. The basic desire of the 5, the first one of our 3, is to be competent, for the world to look at them and say, you have enough knowledge to survive any situation. If there's a problem, look to the 5, he's got an answer. The fives don't want to be seen as lacking in anything related to the knowledge world. Fives tend to, unfortunately, though, devolve into useless specialization. So they tend to hyper focus on one or two things that they dive so deeply into that there's only a handful of people in the entire world who happen to know as much as they do about a particular subject. Now, what started off as this idea of I want to know lots of things about lots of things ends up becoming so much useless knowledge, and they waste so much time digging in and learning about that knowledge where the original goal was to be of use to the world. They find themselves just completely detached from the world because they spend so much time in their own heads and in their own little world learning that they're not actually applying anything that they've learned. What fives learned from others is that it's not okay to be comfortable in the world. This idea that we were meant to struggle through things and figure them out. And if you're comfortable, then you're complacent. And if you're complacent, you should be uncomfortable with that idea. This isn't helped by the fact that at church, fives hear things like, leave your problems at the door. When what fives really needed to hear was that your needs are not a burden, that you can actually ask for help, that the people around you actually do want to help you with whatever is going on, and they need to hear that from you because sometimes they don't even know what's going on in your own world. You're so isolated and so internalized that nobody can see the emotions going through your mind and your heart. And so fives really need to be told by people around them, your needs are not a burden. We're here for you. We want to help you. All of that contributes to the deadly sin of the five, which is avarice. And for some of you, you don't know what that word is. It's another word for greed. But this isn't just a monetary thing. In fact, it's often not monetary at all. But fives believe that they don't have enough of anything to go around. It may be, I don't have enough time, and so therefore I'm not going to contribute. It could be, I don't have enough emotional capacity to handle this situation, and so I'm just going to leave. It could be, I don't have enough love to offer to someone, and so I'm not going to attempt it. But there's a lot of withholding involved, that I have just a little bit, and for some reason I don't have as much as everybody else. And so in order to survive, in order to guarantee that I can survive the world around me and the situations around me, my best bet is to just hold on to it just in case, because you never know if I'm going to need it and it's not going to be there. Fives can also, though, be a huge hope and inspiration to the people around them, because in a five, we see the aspects of God in his omniscience and his wisdom, the fact that he knows all things and that he gives good advice. So if you're looking for any of those things and to be reminded of that about God, find a five in your life. Next, we have the six, whose basic desire is to be secure, to finally be safe. That ends up being distorted by the six to attachment to beliefs, that they can build these walls inside their mind and in their world that if I do this and I do this and I do this, then I can finally be safe. And it may be true, it may not be, but when those beliefs are questioned in any way, they're going to hold on extremely tightly to them and refuse to believe anything other than that. You can see that a lot in religious zealotry, that when presented with any sort of, or political for that matter, when presented with any sort of actual facts or any sort of Bible verses that contradicts what it is that they're saying and they're believing, they just will stubbornly say, well, that's not what I believe. It's hard to argue with that. What the sixes learn from others is that it's not okay to trust yourself, that you can't be trusted to make good decisions, You remember those times that you screwed up and you ruined this for somebody around you. Maybe you did something that was unsafe one time, and now the rest of your life people won't let you live it down. But sixes have a hard time then trusting themselves to make the right decision. And so they end up becoming the type of person who will second guess everything that not only they do, but the people around them do, because they want to weigh all the options and make sure there's a good solution for this, because I need to consult with this person and this person and this person and this person, because I can't trust myself to make the right decision alone. But if I can get the corroboration of 5 other people around me, then maybe I can possibly believe that my decision is a good one. What sixes heard at church is that hell is a place of eternal torment and torture. That's not a good thing for someone whose world is based around fear and the desire for security. And what sixes really needed to hear and continue to need to hear every day of their life is that you're safe. You're with people who are safe. You're in a space that is safe. And nobody's going to do anything to take that away from you. Sixers are the type that walk into a room and they're looking for security cameras. They're looking for potential threats. They're looking for all the things that could possibly go wrong. Sixes need to be reminded by the people around them, it's okay. This is a safe place. You're safe here. Those things contribute to the deadly sin of the 6, which is pretty straightforward. It's fear. Sixes really kind of adhere to Murphy's Law, which is if anything can go wrong, it will. And they really take it up a step beyond that and believe that if anything can go wrong, it probably already has. And so this fear that drives every single one of their decisions means that, again, it's hard for them to trust anything that they do is going to work out. And it makes it hard for them to develop relationships. It makes it hard for them to sometimes to function. The hope that we see in the 6, and what we need to remind even 6s of, is that they're a good reminder of God's steadfast love and loyalty to his people. 6s, because they have a hard time trusting themselves, they build really tight-knit core groups that they adhere to, and they are extremely loyal to. They may test those loyalties just to make sure that they're safe in those spaces, but you're not going to find a more loyal person in your life than a 6. And they're going to be extremely patient and extremely long-suffering in their love for you as well. And finally, we get around to the last number on the circle, which is the 7. The 7's basic desire is to be happy. They want to be a joyful person. But they do that by running away from all the things that don't make them happy. So it ends up being distorted by this frantic escapism that if this one thing doesn't make me happy, well, maybe this will make me happy. And I bounce over to this thing and maybe that'll make me happy. It's not sustainable. And ultimately, we usually find that 7s are not wanting to look back because they're really running from something. And unfortunately, that something tends to always catch up with us, 7 or not. What 7s learn from others is that it's not okay to depend on anyone for anything. This one time this person let me down. This one time this other person let me down. I asked for help when I needed it. Nobody came to my aid, so it's me against the world. And so if this group of people aren't making me happy, aren't helping me accomplish what I'm trying to do, I will move on, I will pack up, and it's not that big of a deal. It's not helped by the fact that 7s at church are told, step out in faith and claim the life that God has for you. Well, great, but that encourages them to continue to move on to other things, because if I stepped out in faith and nothing happened, well, clearly I didn't step out far enough, or that's not really what God wanted me to do, so I'm going to move on to this other thing, and I'm going to step out in faith and claim that life. And it's going to continue to be this moving target, when really what the 7 needs to hear is, you will be taken care of. The people around you do care about you, And if worse comes to worse and the most terrible thing happens in your life, the people around you, you will be taken care of. You don't have to run from these things anymore. And it's really okay to sometimes not be happy. And it's okay to tell people that sometimes you're not happy. The deadly sin of the 7 is gluttony. And that sounds like it's just overindulgence in food, but gluttony really is this idea of too much, consuming too much. Maybe there's the last slice of pizza and everyone else says, no, I'm too full, I'm too full. And the 7 says, well, it's there. I could eat another. I already ate 2 hamburgers. Oh, I could eat another. I already binged watched an entire season of a show on Netflix, and the 7 is the one who says, well, what about one more? Because they don't want the good times, whatever is pleasing them in the moment, to end. And so they'll always say, what about one more? Well, maybe we could do one more. You do a vacation and you know you've got to get back to this thing at work that you're not really looking for. The 7 is probably going to try to figure out a way to extend the vacation. Maybe I could say another couple of days, because they really are trying to avoid pain at all costs. Even if it ends up creating more pain along the way, in the 7's mind, whatever I can do to avoid pain, avoid negative emotions, that's what I want to do. And it usually is by overindulging in whatever it is they can find that makes them happy. Now, a healthy 7 doesn't necessarily act like that at all. A healthy 7 can remind us of God's childlike joy and his boundless energy, that he always has time for us and he's always happy to see us, always happy to be around us. So if you find a 7, thank them for that. And so this rounds out the final triad, the head triad, which is also known as the fear triad. For the 5s, they tend to externalize their fear. And so if there's something that they're concerned about, then they hyper-focus on it and they want to have all the answers so that then they know how to deal with the fear. The 6s break into 2 different categories, and we'll talk more specifically when we talk about 6s later on in the series. 6s can be phobic 6s, which are very fearful, and so they desperately want to forget that they have fears, but they can't. And then there's also the counterphobic 6, who spends the majority of their time trying to deny that they have any fear whatsoever. So either way, the 6s are trying to forget their fear. And then the 7s internalize their fear. They look joyful, happy on the outside, and they're constantly running away from the things that they're afraid of. But you're never really going to quite know exactly what it is that the 7s are worried about. So all of them deal with anxiety and fear in some capacity. So what have we learned today? We learned that the Enneagram really helps us focus more on our motivations for why we do the things that we do, and helps us then get to the source of some of our issues and childhood traumas. And all of it is with the hope that we can become a more whole person, the person we were created to be, instead of going back to our defenses and our defaults and our masks along the way. So I hope you've enjoyed what you've heard so far. If you have any questions, make sure to drop me a line and let me know. If especially you have questions regarding the Enneagram, leave us a message through our voicemail feature or through any of our social media outlets. I would love to be able to address specifically the questions you have about the Enneagram and about personality in general. That's all I had for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I sure did. I hope to see you back here next week for episode 2 on the Enneagram. This episode of One More Thing Before I Go is sponsored by Anchor.fm. When I first had the idea of making the show, my primary obstacle was deciding which platform to use for my recording, hosting, and distribution. Anchor made it so easy because they do all 3 things and much, much more. It's free. They have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will even distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more platforms. You can make money from your podcast, whether you have 2 listeners or 2,000. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. All you have to do is download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. If you like what you heard, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you do your listening. You can even interact with me directly if you go to anchor.fm/One More Thing Podcast. That's the number 1 More Thing Podcast. There you can click on a link to send a voice message. That's a great way to give feedback or let me know if you too would like to be a guest on the show. It's that easy. Special thanks goes out to BigFish_music for providing our theme music and transitions. If you like what you heard, go check him out on Instagram or Facebook. Thanks again for listening to One More Thing Before I Go. Until next time, be good to yourself and be good to others.